The bodies came first. Piled in the streets of ancient cities, whose names we struggle to pronounce today, stacked like cordwood against temple walls, still warm from morning prayers. Imagine standing in those narrow alleys, a cloth pressed against your face, breathing through fabric that does nothing to filter the stench of decomposition, watching neighbors you shared bread with just days before now, swelling in the merciless sun. Your children are crying, asking questions you cannot answer. The priests offer no comfort, only more questions whispered in trembling voices. Have we angered the gods? What sin have we committed to deserve this? But what if they were asking the wrong questions entirely? What if the apocalyptic horrors that shattered ancient civilizations, the catastrophes that filled holy texts with imagery of divine wrath and cosmic punishment, weren't supernatural at all? What if our ancestors watched their world collapse under forces they had no framework to understand, no science to explain, no defense against? They reached for gods and demons because the alternative was far more terrifying. That nature itself could turn against them without reason, without warning, without mercy. Modern science has done something extraordinary and deeply unsettling. It has looked back at 6 of history's most legendary disasters, events so catastrophic they became myth, and found explanations that make them more horrifying than any ancient storyteller could have imagined. Because these weren't punishments, they were patterns. Natural events that followed laws we're only beginning to understand, laws that are still in effect today, waiting for the right conditions to unleash that same ancient terror on our modern world. We think we're different from our ancestors. We have early warning systems, emergency protocols, scientific understanding. But when the crops begin to wither for reasons we cannot explain, when the sky turns colors that defy our meteorological models, when people start dying and our hospitals overflow and our experts offer conflicting theories, how different are we really? Would we be any less terrified? Any less desperate for answers? Any less helpless? The ancient world ended not once, but many times. And it could happen again. In the second year of the war between Athens and Sparta, something far more terrible than any enemy army slipped through the walls that protected the most brilliant city in the ancient world. The plague that descended upon Athens in 430 BCE would become one of the most catastrophic disease outbreaks in recorded history, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population and forever altering the trajectory of Western civilization. What makes this ancient pestilence particularly haunting is not merely its devastating death toll, but the meticulous eyewitness account left behind by the historian Thucydides, himself a survivor of the disease, whose clinical descriptions continue to baffle medical researchers over 2,000 years later. Athens in 430 BCE stood at the pinnacle of her power and glory. The city had transformed herself into the cultural and intellectual heart of the Greek world, where democracy was born, where philosophy flourished in the agora, where playwrights crafted tragedies that still move audiences today. The Parthenon gleamed white on the Acropolis, its construction recently completed under the visionary leadership of Pericles. But the brilliance of Athens had also bred resentment and fear among her neighbors, particularly Sparta, that austere military state in the Peloponnese. The resulting conflict, known as the Peloponnesian War, had erupted just 1 year earlier, and Pericles had devised what seemed like a sound defensive strategy. Rather than meet the superior Spartan army in open battle, Pericles ordered all inhabitants of the Attic countryside to abandon their farms and villages and crowd behind the protection of Athens' formidable walls. The city had the resources to withstand a siege. Her navy controlled the seas, ensuring a steady flow of grain from distant lands. The famous long walls connected Athens to her port at Piraeus, creating an impregnable corridor to the sea. On parchment, the plan appeared flawless. In practice, it created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. By the summer of 430 BCE, Athens had swollen far beyond her normal capacity. Refugees from the countryside crowded into every available space within the walls. They slept in temples, in makeshift shanties, in the narrow streets themselves. Sanitation systems designed for a much smaller population were overwhelmed. In the stifling heat of the Mediterranean summer, with the Spartan army camped in the countryside burning the abandoned farms, something deadly found its way into this overcrowded, stressed, unsanitary urban environment. Thucydides tells us that the plague arrived first in Piraeus, the port city, brought likely aboard a merchant vessel from Ethiopia or Egypt, though its precise origin remained unclear even to ancient observers. From Piraeus, it spread rapidly to Athens proper, moving through the densely packed population like fire through dry grass. What began as isolated cases quickly exploded into an epidemic of unprecedented scale and horror. The symptoms, as Thucydides meticulously recorded them, were nightmarish. The disease struck suddenly, without warning. Victims in perfect health would feel a violent heat beginning in the head. Their eyes became inflamed and red. The throat and tongue turned bloody. The breath became irregular and foul-smelling. Sneezing and hoarseness followed, and then the infection descended into the chest, bringing with it a powerful cough and violent convulsions that racked the body. What came next was even more terrible. The stomach rejected all sustenance, bringing up every kind of bile that physicians could name, accompanied by intense suffering. Most victims were seized by an unquenchable thirst, a burning from within that no amount of water could satisfy. The skin became covered in small pustules and ulcers, the flesh so sensitive that victims could not bear even the lightest linen clothing. They tore off their garments and ran naked through the streets, throwing themselves into the public wells and cisterns, desperately seeking relief from the infernal heat that consumed them from within. Thucydides reports that many who plunged themselves into the cold water died there, their bodies contaminating the very water supply upon which the city depended. The fever was so intense that victims described feeling as though they were burning alive. Some, in their delirium, threw themselves from rooftops or ran screaming through the streets. The suffering was relentless, offering no respite day or night. Most victims died on the 7th or 9th day from the internal heat, though those who survived this initial crisis faced a new horror as the disease descended into the bowels, producing severe ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea that brought death through weakness and dehydration. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Thucydides noted that even those who survived the acute phase of the illness often bore terrible marks. Some lost their eyesight. Others lost fingers, toes, or even their genitals as the disease caused flesh to simply necrotize and fall away. Memory loss afflicted many survivors, who would wander the streets unable to recognize their own families or even remember their own names. The psychological trauma was as devastating as the physical scars. No medical treatment proved effective. Physicians died in greater numbers than anyone else, as their constant proximity to the sick ensured heavy exposure to the contagion. Prayers and supplications at the temples brought no relief. The oracle at Delphi seemed powerless. Traditional remedies failed completely. What helped one patient seemed to harm another. The randomness of who lived and who died only deepened the terror. As bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, the social fabric of Athens began to disintegrate in ways that shocked even Thucydides, a man not easily horrified. The Athenians had always been meticulous about funeral rites, believing that proper burial was essential for the peace of the dead and the living alike. These sacred customs, observed for generations, collapsed within weeks. People died alone and abandoned. Families fled from their own sick relatives, leaving them to perish without comfort or care. The streets filled with bodies. Temples, those sacred spaces where citizens once gathered to honor the gods, became charnel houses piled high with corpses. The dead lay unburied, rotting in the summer heat. The stench of decay hung over the city like a miasma. Those who still retained some piety attempted to cremate or bury their dead, but the sheer number of corpses made individual funeral rites impossible. Mass graves were dug outside the walls. Pyres burned continuously, their smoke visible for miles. Thucydides describes scenes of almost unimaginable indignity. People would arrive at a funeral pyre with their own dead, only to find another family's pyre already burning. They would throw their corpse onto the stranger's fire and flee, or they would wait until a pyre was lit and then secretly throw their dead upon it when no one was watching. The breakdown of funeral customs represented something deeper and more troubling than mere practical necessity. It signaled the collapse of the moral and social order that held Athenian civilization together. If citizens would not honor their own dead parents, siblings, and children, what other sacred duties would they abandon? Thucydides observed that the plague destroyed not just bodies, but the ethical foundations of society. People who had always lived virtuously saw no reason to continue. Why observe the laws when death might strike tomorrow? Why save money for the future when there might be no future? Why show respect to the gods when the gods showed no mercy? A spirit of lawlessness and self-indulgence swept through the city. People openly pursued pleasures they once would have hidden. They spent money recklessly, seeing no point in saving for an old age they might never reach. Honor and shame, those twin pillars of Greek society, seemed meaningless in the face of random, agonizing death. The plague struck hardest at the crowded refugee camps, but it did not spare the wealthy or powerful. In 429 BCE, the disease claimed its most famous victim. Pericles, the architect of Athenian democracy, the brilliant orator who had guided Athens to her golden age, the man whose vision had built the Parthenon, fell ill with the plague. He lingered for some time, his powerful mind trapped in a failing body, before finally succumbing. His death deprived Athens of her greatest leader at the moment of her greatest crisis. The loss would prove catastrophic for the city's long-term prospects in the war. The plague returned in successive waves. After the initial outbreak in 430, it reappeared in the winter of 427, and again in 426 died. Each recurrence killed more of Athens' depleted population. By the time the disease finally exhausted itself, an estimated 1/3 of the population was dead, including countless young men who would have served in the military. Athens' manpower, her most precious resource in the long struggle against Sparta, had been devastated not by enemy soldiers but by invisible microbes. The impact on the Peloponnesian War was profound. Athens never fully recovered her strength. The loss of Pericles left a leadership vacuum filled by lesser men, including the reckless Alcibiades, whose adventurism would lead Athens into catastrophic defeats. The plague weakened not just Athens' military capacity, but her civic confidence and moral authority. The city that had once seemed blessed by the gods, destined to lead Greece into a new age of enlightenment, had been humbled by disease. The war dragged on for another 2 decades, ending finally in 404, with Athens' complete defeat and the temporary end of democracy. For over 2,000 years, scholars have debated the identity of the plague that struck Athens. Thucydides' account is remarkable in its clinical precision, yet the symptoms he describes match no single modern disease perfectly. Various theories have been proposed, each with compelling arguments and notable weaknesses. Typhoid fever was long considered the leading candidate. The disease spreads through contaminated water, which aligns with Athens' overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. The high fever, gastrointestinal symptoms, and characteristic rash match portions of Thucydides' description. However, typhoid does not typically cause the extreme pustulation or the loss of extremities that Thucydides describes. Smallpox has been suggested, given the pustules and high mortality rate. Yet, smallpox does not usually produce the violent gastrointestinal symptoms or the intense, unquenchable thirst that drove victims into wells. More recently, some researchers have proposed epidemic typhus, spread by body lice, which would have thrived in the overcrowded condition. Others have suggested a hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola, noting the bleeding from mucous membranes and the extremely high mortality among healthcare providers. A 2006 analysis of dental pulp from a mass grave in Athens detected DNA sequences suggesting typhoid, but the findings remain controversial and not universally accepted. The most unsettling possibility is that the plague of Athens was caused by a pathogen that no longer exists, or that has evolved into something unrecognizable. Diseases mutate, emerge, and sometimes disappear. The microorganism that terrorized Athens might have died out centuries ago, or it might persist in some reservoir population, waiting for the right conditions to emerge again. This uncertainty carries its own kind of horror. We can sequence genomes, split atoms, and send robots to Mars, yet we cannot identify with certainty the disease that killed 1/3 of the most powerful city in the ancient world. History preserves Thucydides' meticulous observations, but the physical reality of the pathogen itself has vanished beyond recovery. The Plague of Athens stands as a reminder that civilization, no matter how advanced, remains vulnerable to forces beyond human control. In a matter of months, disease accomplished what the Spartan army could not in years of warfare. It brought the proud city to her knees, shattered her social order, and changed the course of Western history. Had Athens maintained her full strength, Had Pericles survived to guide the war effort, the entire trajectory of Greek and Roman history might have unfolded differently. Democracy might have been strengthened rather than discredited. Athens, rather than Sparta, might have dominated Greece, leading to a very different Hellenistic period and Roman conquest. Every plague carries lessons for future generations. The Plague of Athens teaches us that urban density without adequate sanitation invites disaster, that disease can determine the outcome of wars and the fate of civilizations, and that even our most brilliant achievements offer no protection against microscopic enemies we cannot see or understand. Thucydides survived to write his history, preserving for us not just the facts of the plague, but the texture of the experience, the breakdown of everything that makes us human when faced with incomprehensible suffering. His words echo across millennia, a voice from the dead city, warning us that the next plague is always waiting. The sky above the Aegean Sea turned black in the middle of the afternoon. Somewhere around 1600 years before the Common Era, the island of Thera, which we now call Santorini, exploded with a force that makes our modern nuclear weapons seem like children's fireworks. The eruption sent a column of ash and pumice 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. Tsunamis taller than 10-story buildings radiated outward across the Mediterranean. And according to a growing number of scientists, this geological catastrophe may have set in motion the most terrifying sequence of environmental disasters ever recorded, a sequence that would be remembered for millennia as the biblical plagues of Egypt. For generations, the 10 plagues have been understood as divine intervention, the hand of God reaching down to free the enslaved Israelites. But what if our ancestors witnessed something equally awesome and equally terrible? What if they stood at the edge of a genuine environmental apocalypse and tried to make sense of it with the only framework they had, the language of the divine? This is not about debunking faith or dismissing ancient texts as mere fantasy. This is about understanding that sometimes the most supernatural-sounding stories emerge from the most natural, most terrible events our planet can produce. And perhaps most chilling of all, it is about recognizing that the same cascade of disasters could happen again, that the dominoes are still standing, still waiting for something to knock the first one over. The Thera eruption ranks among the most powerful volcanic events in human history. When the island exploded, it sent roughly 60 cubic kilometers of rock, ash, and pumice into the air. The volcanic explosivity index rates it as a 7 on a scale that goes to 8, making it roughly 100 times more powerful than the Mount Vesuvius eruption that buried Pompeii. The sound of the explosion would have carried for thousands of kilometers. The ash cloud would have blotted out the sun across the entire eastern Mediterranean. Now here's where the domino effect theory becomes fascinating and deeply unsettling. Geologists have traced volcanic ash from Thera across Egypt, Turkey, and the Middle East. The timeline, while difficult to pin down with absolute precision, places this eruption within the general period when Exodus might have occurred, somewhere in the late Bronze Age. More importantly, scientists have begun to map out exactly how one volcanic eruption could trigger the specific sequence of disasters described in the biblical text. The first domino falls in the Nile River itself. The first plague describes the water turning to blood, becoming foul and undrinkable, killing the fish. Epidemiologists and environmental scientists point to a phenomenon called a red tide or harmful algal bloom. Under normal conditions, these microscopic organisms exist in balance, but pump massive amounts of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, and something changes. The ash, rich in iron and nutrients, eventually settles. When it falls into rivers and waterways, it acts like fertilizer. Imagine the Nile in the weeks following the Thera eruption. The sky clears somewhat, but now a fine coating of ash covers everything. Rain washes this mineral-rich ash into the tributaries, into the river itself. The water becomes supersaturated with nutrients. Certain species of freshwater algae, particularly the kind known as burgundy blood algae or Oscillatoria rubescens, thrive in these conditions. They reproduce explosively, turning the water a deep, disturbing red. But the color is only the beginning of the horror. These algae blooms produce toxins, natural poisons that kill fish by the thousand. The ancient text describes the fish dying and the river stinking, an exact match for what happens during a massive algal bloom. Anyone who has witnessed a major red tide event describes the same thing. Dead fish floating on the surface, the water dark and rust-colored, the smell of decay hanging in the air like a physical presence. For people who depended entirely on the Nile for drinking water, for irrigation, for life itself, this transformation would have seemed apocalyptic. But the dying river triggers the second domino. Frogs, according to the biblical account, suddenly swarm out of the Nile in massive numbers, invading homes and streets before dying en masse. Environmental scientists have a straightforward explanation. Frogs are amphibians, capable of surviving in water or on land, but they prefer the water. When their aquatic habitat becomes toxic, when the oxygen levels drop because of algae consuming it all, when the water fills with poison, they have no choice. They flee onto land. Picture the scene. The Nile, once the lifeline of Egyptian civilization, is now a chemical soup of dead fish and toxic algae. Every frog, every amphibian living in that vast river system suddenly faces a simple equation: stay, die, or leave. They leave in their millions. The biblical text describes them everywhere, in the houses, in the bedrooms, in the ovens, in the kneading bowls. This is not exaggeration. This is what happens when an entire ecosystem collapses simultaneously. And then, stranded on land, away from their normal habitat, stressed and poisoned by the toxins they have already absorbed, they die. Millions of frog corpses rotting in the Egyptian heat. Which brings us to the third domino. And here the cascade becomes truly nightmarish. The text describes an infestation of lice or gnats, depending on the translation. Then, in the fourth plague, flies. Epidemiologists point out that millions of dead frogs create perfect breeding conditions for insects. Frogs are natural predators of mosquitoes, gnats, and flies. Remove the frogs from the ecosystem, add millions of rotting corpses for flies to lay their eggs in, and you create an explosion of insect life. But these are not ordinary insects anymore. Flies that feed on rotting, diseased flesh become vectors for disease. The fifth plague describes pestilence killing livestock. The sixth describes boils breaking out on humans and animals. Here is where environmental catastrophe becomes epidemic. The flies, breeding in toxic conditions, feeding on poisoned frogs, become carriers of multiple diseases simultaneously. Anthrax is a strong candidate, a bacterial disease that affects livestock and can spread to humans, causing the kind of skin lesions described as boils. Imagine being an Egyptian farmer during this cascade. First, your water source turned to blood and poison. Then frogs invaded your home and died everywhere. Then came insects in numbers you have never seen, so many that the air itself seemed to buzz and riddle. And now your cattle are dying? Mysterious sores are appearing on your skin, on your children's skin. There is no escape, no safe place. Each plague emerges organically from the previous one, each disaster making the next one inevitable. The seventh plague brings hail mixed with fire. Volcanic eruptions produce spectacular lightning shows, static electricity generated by ash particles colliding in the eruption column. If Thera's ash cloud reached Egypt, it could have brought volcanic lightning with it. The hail itself might be explained by rapid temperature changes in the upper atmosphere caused by the massive injection of volcanic material, or by hailstones formed around particles of volcanic ash. Whatever fell from the sky that day, it destroyed the crops that had somehow survived everything else. Plague 8 is locusts, and here the domino effect becomes almost mathematically predictable. Locusts swarm when environmental conditions trigger a transformation in their biology. Drought followed by sudden vegetation growth creates ideal conditions. The volcanic ash, the disrupted weather patterns, the damaged but recovering crops. All of this creates a perfect storm for a locust plague. These insects can darken the sky, can strip every green thing down to bare wood, can reduce a landscape to desert in days. The ninth plague, darkness covering the land for 3 days, might be the most directly connected to volcanic activity. Large eruptions can create darkness at noon, ash clouds so thick that daylight cannot penetrate. Witnesses to major eruptions describe this exact phenomenon. Day turning to night, a darkness so complete you cannot see your hand in front of your face. The biblical text says it was a darkness that could be felt, a visceral, physical darkness. Anyone who has experienced heavy ashfall describes it exactly this way: the air thick and choking, the darkness oppressive and tangible. And then comes the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. This is the hardest to explain through natural phenomena, but epidemiologists have proposed a chilling possibility. In ancient Egypt, the firstborn received preferential treatment, larger portions of food, first access to grain stores. If those grain stores had been contaminated perhaps by mycotoxins from mold that grew after the environmental disruptions, perhaps by some other poison, the firstborn, eating more of the contaminated food, would be the first to die, would die in greater number. It is a theory, one among several, but it demonstrates how even the most supernatural-seeming plague might have a natural origin. What we are looking at is not 10 separate miracles, but one environmental catastrophe, triggering a cascade of secondary and tertiary disaster. Each plague creates the conditions for the next one. It is a domino effect written in ash and blood and dead fish, in rotting frogs and swarming insects, in dying cattle and failing crops. And here is what should terrify us. The dominoes are still standing. The supervolcanoes are still out there. Yellowstone sits above a magma chamber that, if it erupted, would make Thera look insignificant. The Campi Flegrei caldera, near Naples, shows signs of increasing activity. We live on a geologically active planet, and we have built a civilization that depends on stable weather, reliable water sources, functioning ecosystems. A major volcanic eruption today would not just create ash clouds and tsunamis, it would trigger the same cascades. Algal blooms in rivers. Ecosystem collapses. Disease vectors spreading unchecked. Crop failures. Famine. And we are more vulnerable now, not less. We have more people depending on fewer water sources. We have industrial agriculture that can fail catastrophically. We have global supply chains that can break. The plagues of Egypt were not myth, they were memory. They were the story of how the world can fall apart, step by terrible step, each disaster birthing the next. And the story is not over. The earth still holds that power. The cascades are still possible. We simply have not knocked over the first domino yet. The Roman soldier clutched his stomach as another wave of nausea swept over him. His skin burned with fever, his throat parched despite drinking water that tasted like ash. But worse than the pain, worse than the weakness that had stolen the strength from his limbs, were the pustules now emerging across his arms and chest. Dark, raised, unmistakable. He had survived the wars in Mesopotamia, had watched his brothers in arms fall to Persian arrows and desert heat, only to bring something far more terrible home with him. The year was 165, and the legions of Rome were returning victorious from the east. Emperor Lucius Verus had led them deep into Mesopotamian territory, sacking cities, claiming glory for Rome. The soldiers marched home with wagons full of treasure, slaves trailing in chains behind them, their spirits high with conquest. They could not have known they carried an invisible enemy, one that would prove more devastating than any barbarian horde. Within months of their return, the first cases appeared in the crowded port cities. Within a year, the pandemic had spread throughout the entire empire like fire racing through dry grain. Rome had faced plagues before, but nothing in living memory compared to what physicians began calling the Antonine Plague, named for the dynasty that ruled when the world seemed to be ending. The Greek physician Galen, perhaps the most celebrated medical mind of his age, found himself confronting a disease that defied his understanding of the humors and the natural balance he had spent his life studying. He documented his observations with the meticulous care of a man who knew he was witnessing something unprecedented, something that future generations would need to understand. The fever came first, Galen wrote, sudden and intense, striking victims with the force of a physical blow. Their skin would burn to the touch, hot enough that some patients claimed they could feel themselves cooking from within. The throat became inflamed, swollen, making each swallow an agony. Then came the diarrhea, relentless and bloody, draining the body of fluids faster than they could be replaced. Patients would cry out for water, their tongues swollen and blackened, their lips cracked and bleeding. But it was the skin eruptions that marked this plague as something entirely new to the Western world. Around the 9th day of illness, those who survived the initial fever would develop a rash. At first it appeared as small red spots, almost innocuous, scattered across the chest and back. But these spots would transform with horrifying speed. They raised into firm pustules, filled with thick fluid that seemed to glow with an opalescent sheen. The pustules spread across the entire body, covering the face until victims became unrecognizable to their own families. They appeared inside the mouth and throat, making eating impossible, making breathing itself an ordeal. Some patients would go blind as the eruptions consumed their eyes. Others would feel their skin peeling away in sheets, exposing raw flesh beneath. Galen himself fled Rome when the plague reached its peak, a decision that would haunt his reputation, but one that undoubtedly saved his life. He had treated enough patients to understand that proximity meant death. He had watched his colleagues fall, physicians who believed their knowledge and status would somehow protect them. They died like everyone else, covered in pustules, crying out for relief that never came. Galen retreated to his estates, where he continued to write, continued to try to make sense of what he had witnessed. His descriptions, preserved across the centuries, paint a picture that modern epidemiologists recognize with chilling certainty. This was almost certainly smallpox, making its first devastating appearance in the populations of Europe and North Africa. The disease killed with a ruthless efficiency that left Roman society reeling. Historians estimate that between 5 and 10 million people perished over the 15 years the plague ravaged the empire, though the true number will never be known. In some regions, a quarter of the population simply ceased to exist. Villages were found completely empty, their inhabitants all dead or fled, crops rotting in fields that no one remained to harvest. The cities, those great monuments to Roman civilization and engineering, became death traps where the disease spread with terrifying speed. Walk through the streets of Rome in 166 or 167, and you would see a capital transformed into a necropolis. The forums that once buzzed with commerce and political debate stood nearly empty. The few people who ventured out wrapped cloth around their faces, believing that bad air carried the contagion. They avoided looking at each other, avoided any contact, because no one knew who might be carrying death inside them. Shops remained shuttered, their owners either dead or too terrified to open for business. The famous Roman baths, those centers of social life and civic pride, became places of dread. The warm, moist air that had once been considered healthful was now suspected of spreading disease. The smell of death hung over everything. Rome's carefully designed sanitation systems, once the envy of the ancient world, could not cope with the sheer number of corpses. Traditional funeral rites, which involved elaborate ceremonies and proper cremation or burial, became impossible to maintain. There were simply too many dead and too few living to honor them. The authorities organized mass cremations, pyres that burned day and night on the outskirts of the city. The smoke rose in thick black columns that could be seen for miles, a constant reminder of the catastrophe unfolding. Sometimes there was not enough wood to burn all the bodies, and hasty mass graves were dug instead. Hundreds of corpses tumbled together without ceremony or marker. The living began to avoid the dying in ways that shredded the social fabric of Roman life. Families abandoned sick relatives, leaving them to die alone rather than risk infection. Parents fled from infected children. Slaves were turned out of households at the first sign of fever, left to die in the streets. The bonds of obligation and duty that held Roman society together dissolved in the face of such overwhelming fear. Some physicians continued to treat the sick, but many refused, and no one could blame them. What good was all the learning of Greece and Rome, when it could not save a single pustule-covered patient crying out in agony? The emperor himself could not escape. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, author of the Meditations, ruler of the greatest empire the world had ever known, fell to the plague in 180. Some accounts suggest he died in his military camp along the Danube, still trying to defend the empire's borders, even as disease hollowed it out from within. His death carried enormous symbolic weight. If the emperor, with access to the finest physicians, the best care, the most comfortable isolation possible, could not survive, then no one was safe. The plague killed without regard for rank, or virtue, or wisdom. It was the great leveler, reducing senators and slaves to the same fate. The economic impact rippled through every aspect of Roman life. Trade collapsed as ports closed, and merchants refused to travel. Ships sat idle in harbors because there were not enough healthy sailors to crew them. The agricultural system that fed the empire's cities faltered as farmers died in their fields. Survivors found themselves unable to work their land alone, and vast estates fell into disuse. Food shortages led to inflation, and inflation led to hoarding, which created more shortages. The government attempted to impose price controls, but these were largely ineffective. The complex economic machinery of the empire, built over centuries of expansion and refinement, ground to a halt. Military recruitment became nearly impossible. The legions that had once seemed invincible found their ranks depleted by disease. Young men who might have sought glory in military service were dead or too weak to fight. The borders of the empire, constantly threatened by Germanic tribes and Persian forces, became dangerously undermanned. Enemies who might have hesitated to challenge Rome at its height now sensed weakness. They probed the frontiers, testing defenses, launching raids. Rome found itself unable to respond with its traditional, overwhelming force. The plague had accomplished what decades of warfare could not, breaking the military might that upheld the entire imperial system. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological, a collective trauma that transformed how Romans understood their place in the world. For generations, Roman citizens had been taught that their civilization represented the pinnacle of human achievement, that their gods favored them, that their empire would last forever. The plague shattered these certainties. If the gods were real and loved Rome, why would they allow such suffering? Why would they strike down the innocent and the virtuous alongside the wicked? These questions had no good answers within the traditional Roman religious framework. Into this spiritual crisis came new religious movements, offering explanations and comfort that the old gods could not provide. Christianity, still a minority faith, often viewed with suspicion by Roman authorities, began to attract converts in unprecedented numbers. The Christian message of a kingdom beyond this world, of suffering as a path to salvation, of a God who loved the lowly and promised justice in the afterlife, resonated with people who had watched their world collapse. Christians were also noted for caring for the sick, even non-believers, at great personal risk. This charity stood in stark contrast to the pagan response, which often involved abandoning the ill to their fate. The plague created communities of survivors bound together by shared trauma. Those who recovered from the disease carried the scars for life, their faces marked by pox scars that would never fade. But they were also immune, or so it seemed, able to move among the sick without fear of reinfection. These survivors became invaluable as caregivers and undertakers, performing the grim work that others fled from. They formed their own identity, separate from those who had been spared entirely, marked by both their scars and their unique freedom from fear. Modern historians debate how much the Antonine Plague contributed to Rome's eventual decline and fall. The empire would last for centuries more in the west and over a millennium in the east. But something fundamental shifted during those 15 years of pestilence. The population never fully recovered to its pre-plague levels. The economy never regained its former dynamism. The confidence that had driven Roman expansion and sustained Roman culture was permanently shaken. The plague did not destroy Rome, but it weakened the foundations upon which everything else rested. The responses Romans developed to combat the plague sound eerily familiar to modern ears. They implemented quarantines, isolating infected households and sometimes entire neighborhoods. They restricted travel between cities and provinces. They organized public health measures, such as they understood them, trying to manage waste and clean the streets. They experienced the same economic collapse, the same social fragmentation, the same desperate search for meaning in the face of random death that humans have confronted in every major pandemic since. The particulars change, the medical understanding evolves, but the fundamental human responses remain remarkably constant across the centuries. 2,000 years separate us from the Romans who watched their world transform under the weight of disease, yet their experience speaks directly to our own. Pandemics reshape civilizations not just through the immediate death toll, but through the profound ways they alter how survivors understand themselves and their societies. The Antonine Plague marked the end of Rome's golden age, the last moment when Romans could believe in their own invincibility. What came after was centuries of adaptation, transformation, and eventual transformation into something entirely new. The lesson: written in the scarred faces of survivors and the ashes of mass cremations, is that no civilization stands forever immune to the forces that can bring it low. In the mists of antiquity, nearly 5,000 years before our present age, something catastrophic descended upon the Yellow River Valley. The chronicles tell us that during the reign of Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, the heavens themselves turned against humanity. What began as whispers in ancient texts has evolved into one of the most disturbing mysteries in archaeological investigation, a puzzle that grows darker with each new discovery. The earliest written accounts, transcribed centuries after the events from oral traditions and fragmentary records, speak of serpents falling from the sky. These were not ordinary creatures, but massive writhing forms that seemed to swim through the clouds themselves, their bodies glowing with an otherworldly luminescence. According to the bamboo annals and fragments preserved in later compilations, these sky serpents appeared first as distant lights, dancing on the horizon like stars that had lost their way. Then they grew closer, descending upon villages and settlements with terrifying speed. Witnesses described mists that followed in the serpent's wake, dense vapors that settled over the land like funeral shrouds. These were no ordinary fogs rolling in from the river. The ancient texts speak of colors within the mist, sickly yellows and greens that seemed to glow with their own internal light. Those who breathed these vapors, the chronicles tell us, suffered fates that scribes struggled to describe. Bodies covered in pustules and black marks, blood flowing from every orifice. Entire families dead within days of the mist's arrival. Modern scholars examining these accounts initially dismissed them as pure mythology, fantastical tales meant to glorify the Yellow Emperor's supposed divine interventions. But something changed in the late 20th century when climatologists began reconstructing weather patterns and geological events from the period around 2600 before the Common Era. The data they uncovered painted a picture of genuine catastrophe. Core samples taken from the Yellow River Basin reveal massive flooding events during this precise time frame. The sediment layers show not gradual seasonal flooding, but sudden, violent inundations that would have displaced millions of cubic meters of earth. The scale suggests something far beyond normal monsoon activity. Some researchers have proposed the collapse of natural dam formations upstream, ice dams perhaps, or landslides on a scale difficult to imagine. When such barriers fail, the water behind them doesn't simply flow, it explodes across the landscape with the force of a liquid avalanche. But flooding alone cannot explain the sky serpents or the poisoned mists. Here, volcanology offers a disturbing possibility. Atmospheric scientists have identified signatures in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, dating to approximately this period, indicators of significant volcanic activity somewhere in the northern hemisphere. While no definitive source has been identified in China itself, the atmospheric effects of a major eruption, hundreds or even thousands of miles distant, could manifest exactly as the ancient texts describe. Picture, if you will, the approach of a massive ash cloud from a distant volcanic cataclysm. To people who had never conceived of such phenomena, who possessed no framework for understanding geology or atmospheric science, what would they see? A dark, roiling mass on the horizon, moving with apparent purpose, illuminated from within by lightning generated through friction of ash particles. The resemblance to serpents swimming through the sky becomes less metaphorical and more literal. These observers recorded what they saw as accurately as their cosmology allowed. The mists that followed would have been ashfall and volcanic gases, possibly mixed with sulfuric compounds. Such clouds are indeed toxic, capable of killing quickly and horribly. The symptoms described in the ancient texts, the skin lesions and hemorrhaging, align disturbingly well with acute sulfur dioxide poisoning and the effects of volcanic ash on human tissue. Entire regions could become genuinely uninhabitable, not through divine curse but through the simple reality of air too toxic to breathe and water too contaminated to drink. Yet this explanation, compelling as it may be, does not account for all the details. Archaeological excavations at sites dated to this period have uncovered mass graves, collections of bodies buried hastily and without ceremony, something virtually unheard of in early Chinese culture, where proper burial rites held supreme importance. Analysis of remains where preservation allows has revealed something unexpected. Many skeletons show signs of hemorrhagic disease, but the patterns don't entirely match volcanic poisoning. Microbiologists examining trace organic material from these burial sites have identified bacterial signatures consistent with anthrax. While the discovery sent shockwaves through the academic community. Anthrax, particularly the inhalation form, produces symptoms that match certain descriptions in the ancient texts with chilling precision. The black skin lesions that give the disease its name, the rapid progression to systemic collapse, the hemorrhaging in advanced cases, all of it appears in the fragmentary medical observations preserved from antiquity. The question becomes whether this was naturally occurring anthrax, perhaps spread through livestock die-offs during the flooding and volcanic disruption, or something more sinister. Some researchers have proposed that mass animal deaths caused by environmental catastrophe created perfect conditions for bacterial proliferation. Rotting carcasses scattered across floodplains, weakened human populations with compromised immune systems, contaminated water sources, all the elements necessary for epidemic spread. But here the mystery deepens into darker territory. Chinese historical records from this period are not merely sparse, they contain obvious gaps, places where the narrative thread breaks completely. Later, dynasties acknowledge these gaps, sometimes obliquely referencing events too terrible to record, knowledge deliberately suppressed. The question that haunts researchers is whether this erasure was accidental, the simple loss of fragile documents over millennia, or whether it was purposeful, a calculated decision to bury knowledge of something too horrible to preserve. The mythology that grew around these events transformed catastrophe into divine drama. The Yellow Emperor himself becomes a godlike figure battling demons and dragons, purifying the land through magical combat. Tales speak of him forging legendary weapons, creating medicines from impossible ingredients, calling down celestial intervention to save his people. Scholars recognize in these stories the psychological mechanism of traumatized populations, transforming incomprehensible disaster into narratives of heroic struggle and ultimate triumph. Yet within the mythology lie fragments that ring with historical authenticity. References to entire regions becoming forbidden zones, places where no one could survive, where the very earth rejected human presence. Descriptions of survivors fleeing south and west, abandoning ancestral lands that had sustained their lineages for generations. The myths speak of the Yellow Emperor ordering mass migrations, creating new settlements far from the cursed territories. Archaeological evidence confirms exactly such population movements during this period. Abandoned settlements in the Yellow River Valley and new communities appearing simultaneously in previously unsettled regions. Recent excavations have uncovered something that adds new dimensions to the horror. A site in Shaanxi province, dated through multiple methods to approximately 2600 before the Common Era, contains evidence of settlement on a scale previously unknown for this period. The dig revealed not a thriving community, but a necropolis. Thousands of burials, perhaps tens of thousands, the excavation is ongoing, all apparently interred within a relatively short time frame. What makes this discovery particularly disturbing is the evidence of social collapse visible in the burial practices. The earliest burials show some attempt at proper ritual, bodies oriented correctly, grave goods included, efforts made to honor the dead. As you progress through the chronological layers, these practices deteriorate. Bodies are jumbled together, sometimes dozens in pits meant for family groups. Grave goods disappear entirely. The final layers show no organization at all, simply masses of human remains deposited and covered with earth. This progression tells a story more terrible than any myth. It speaks of a community overwhelmed by death on such a scale that the living could no longer maintain their most fundamental cultural practices. The archaeologists working the site describe an atmosphere of palpable tragedy, the sense that they are uncovering evidence of genuine apocalypse, the end of a world. Isotope analysis of teeth from the remains reveals something unexpected. These people were not local to the region. They came from hundreds of miles away, from the Yellow River heartland, refugees from something that drove them to abandon everything familiar. They survived long enough to reach this place, to attempt building new lives, only to die en masse from causes that remain unclear. This is where the investigation stands today, balanced between hard evidence and haunting questions. We have proof of environmental catastrophe, floods, and likely volcanic effects. We have evidence of disease, bacterial infections, spreading through vulnerable populations. We have geological disruption, climate anomalies, mass death, and population displacement. We have mythological accounts that preserve genuine historical kernels within layers of supernatural embellishment. What we don't have are answers to the deepest questions. How many died in total? The myths speak of millions perishing, numbers that seem impossible for the population densities of the time, yet the archaeological evidence keeps expanding the scale of the tragedy. Was this purely natural disaster? Or did human actions, warfare perhaps, or early biological accidents, contribute to the catastrophe? The deliberate gaps in the historical record suggest knowledge that later generations chose not to preserve. And most disturbing of all, what exactly did the ancient chroniclers witness that they could only describe as sky serpents and divine battles? Were they simply translating volcanic and atmospheric phenomena into the only terms their cosmology provided? Or is there something else, some element of these events that we have not yet identified, that remains hidden in the lost records and forbidden zones of ancient China? The investigation continues, each new discovery raising more questions than it answers, each excavation revealing the catastrophe was worse than previously believed. And somewhere in the earth of the Yellow River Valley, more evidence waits silent testimony to horrors that ancient China chose to transform into myth rather than remember as history. The spring of 541 came to Constantinople with all the beauty and promise that the season always brought to the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. The city glittered along the shores of the Bosporus, its marble palaces catching the morning light, its harbors crowded with ships bearing treasures from across the known world. Emperor Justinian stood at the height of his power, his armies reconquering lost Roman territories in North Africa and Italy, his architects raising the magnificent dome of the Hagia Sophia toward heaven. The dream of restoring the full glory of the Roman Empire seemed within reach. But in those spring months, something else was reaching Constantinople, something that would transform that dream into a nightmare and reshape the entire course of human civilization. The plague arrived by ship, as plagues so often do. It came from Egypt, carried in the holds of grain vessels that supplied the capital's million inhabitants with bread. But it brought something far darker than wheat. The first cases appeared in the harbor districts, among the dock workers and merchants who handled cargo from infected ports. Within days, the disease began its terrible spread through the crowded streets and tenements of the city. The symptoms began innocuously enough. A fever, perhaps. A chill. The kind of minor ailment that might afflict anyone in a crowded urban center. But then came the horror that would define this plague in the historical memory. Within hours of the first fever, victims developed grotesque swellings in their groins, armpits, and necks. These buboes, as they came to be called, grew to the size of apples, black and purple and screaming with pain. The flesh around them turned dark, as if death was creeping outward from these terrible nodes. The pain was said to be unbearable, driving many victims into fits of delirium and madness. Procopius, the court historian, who witnessed the plague firsthand, left us accounts so vivid and horrifying that they still possess the power to chill the blood nearly 1,500 years later. He wrote of victims seized by hallucinations, seeing demons that haunted them until death. Some fell into deep stupors, lying motionless while their bodies rotted from within. Others became violently manic, running through the streets in terror, attacking anyone who came near them in their delirium. The buboes sometimes burst open, releasing foul-smelling pus and blood. When this happened, victims sometimes survived, but more often, death came within 2 to 5 days of the first symptoms, swift and merciless. What made the plague particularly terrifying was its seeming randomness. It struck rich and poor alike, though the crowded tenements of the poor saw higher death rates. It killed the young and healthy as readily as the old and infirm. Physicians who attempted to treat the sick died at their bedsides. Priests who administered last rites fell victim within days. Family members who cared for the afflicted were almost inevitably infected themselves. The disease showed no mercy, no pattern that the living could discern and perhaps protect themselves against. It simply killed, relentlessly, and without end. Procopius recorded that at the plague's height, 10,000 people were dying in Constantinople every single day. Imagine that number. 10,000 individual lives, each with their own stories, dreams, and loved ones, extinguished daily in a single city. The normal mechanisms for dealing with death simply collapsed under this impossible burden. At first, families tried to bury their dead with proper rites and dignity, but within weeks, the living could no longer keep pace with the dying. The city's graveyards filled to overflowing. Desperate officials commandeered every available space for burial. They dug mass graves in public squares, in gardens, anywhere the earth could be turned. Still, the bodies accumulated faster than graves could be prepared. The stench of death hung over Constantinople like a physical presence. Bodies lay in the streets, in doorways, in homes where entire families had perished, with no one left to move the corpses. The normal fabric of civilization began to unravel in the face of such overwhelming mortality. Then came the solutions born of pure desperation. Officials ordered the roofs torn off the massive defensive towers that ringed the city. Work crews, their faces wrapped in cloth, soaked in vinegar and herbs, began hauling bodies up into these towers and stacking them inside like cordwood. They packed the corpses in tight layer upon layer until the towers became vertical charnel houses. When even these towers filled, they turned to the sea. Boats loaded with bodies rowed out into the waters of the Bosporus and the Golden Horn, dumping their cargo overboard. The waters around Constantinople became a vast liquid cemetery, bodies floating on the tides, washing up on distant shores. The living walked through a city transformed into a vision of the apocalypse. Those who had not yet fallen ill wore amulets and charms, clutched holy relics, prayed in churches that grew emptier by the day, as worshippers either died or fled. Trade ceased. The law courts closed. The bathhouses and markets stood empty. The great project of building the Hagia Sophia ground to a halt as workers died or abandoned the city. Even the government itself barely functioned. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill with the plague, suffering through the fever and developing the characteristic buboes. Unlike most victims, he survived, though he emerged weakened from the ordeal. His plans for reconquest, his grand vision of a restored Roman Empire, would never fully recover from what the plague had wrought. For 2 years, the plague ravaged Constantinople with varying intensity. Then, it began to spread outward in waves across the Byzantine Empire and beyond. It struck Antioch and Alexandria. It swept through Syria and Palestine. It crossed into Persia, traveled the trade routes into Arabia, and sailed with merchant vessels to ports throughout the Mediterranean. Wherever ships went, the plague followed. Wherever trade caravans traveled, death came in their wake. The scale of mortality defies easy comprehension. Modern historians, analyzing the contemporary accounts and archaeological evidence, estimate that the Plague of Justinian, as it came to be known, killed between 30 and 50 million people over the course of 2 centuries. The disease would retreat for years, then surge back in devastating waves. Entire regions were depopulated. Villages and small towns simply ceased to exist, their populations wiped out entirely. Agricultural production collapsed in many areas as there were no longer enough living farmers to work the land. Economic networks that had functioned for centuries fell apart. For over 1,000 years, historians debated the exact nature of the disease that had caused such catastrophic mortality. The descriptions in ancient texts clearly indicated some form of plague, but which disease precisely? The buboes suggested bubonic plague, but could the sources be trusted? Were they exaggerating, misremembering, embellishing for dramatic effect? Then came the revolution of modern genetic science. In recent decades, archaeologists excavating mass graves from the 6th century have found something extraordinary. Buried in the dental pulp of plague victims, protected and preserved within the teeth for 1,500 years, was DNA.I. Microscopic fragments of genetic material from the pathogen that killed these ancient victims. Scientists extracted this ancient DNA with painstaking care and analyzed it with the most sophisticated tools of molecular biology. The results were definitive and chilling. The DNA belonged to Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague, the same organism that would return 800 years later as the Black Death, killing 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century. The same disease that still exists today in rodent populations around the world, causing occasional human cases. The genetic evidence confirmed that Procopius had not been exaggerating. The horror he described was real, caused by one of the most deadly pathogens ever to afflict humanity. The plague of Justinian reshaped the medieval world in ways that echo through history to our present day. The Eastern Roman Empire never fully recovered from the demographic catastrophe. Justinian's dream of reuniting the old Roman territories died with the millions who perished in the plague years. The weakened Byzantine state found itself vulnerable to new threats. Within a century, Arab armies inspired by the new religion of Islam would conquer vast Byzantine territories in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The plague had created the conditions for a wholesale transformation of the Mediterranean world. In Western Europe, the plague accelerated the collapse of classical civilization. Already weakened by earlier barbarian invasions and political fragmentation, the Western territories suffered devastating population losses. Urban centers shrank or disappeared entirely. Literacy rates plummeted as the educated classes died and the infrastructure to support learning collapsed. Trade networks contracted. Technological knowledge was lost. The period we call the Dark Ages deepened, and the plague bears significant responsibility for the decline. Civilization itself seemed to be flickering out across large parts of the former Roman world. The psychological impact on survivors may have been equally profound. Imagine living through wave after wave of plague over decades, watching populations decimated repeatedly, never knowing if the next outbreak would claim you or your loved ones. The sense of divine judgment, of the world itself coming to an end, must have been overwhelming. Some historians argue that the fatalism and otherworldliness that characterized much of medieval thought had its roots in the trauma of the plague centuries. When death could strike so swiftly and randomly, when human knowledge and power proved so utterly inadequate against disease, why invest hope in earthly achievements? The bacterium that caused all this suffering never truly disappeared. Yersinia pestis persists in wild rodent populations across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Prairie dogs in the western United States carry the disease. Ground squirrels in Central Asia harbor it. It causes a few dozen human cases most years, usually quickly treated with modern antibiotics. But the organism that killed tens of millions remains out there, evolving, adapting, persisting across the centuries. Scientists who study the genetics of Yersinia pestis have discovered something deeply unsettling. The bacterium is capable of rapid mutation. New strains emerge regularly in wild populations. The strain that caused the Justinian plague was genetically distinct from the one that caused the Black Death. That means the disease evolved significantly between the 6th and 14th century. Today's strains differ from their medieval ancestors as well. The plague bacterium is still changing, still adapting to new hosts and new environments. Even more concerning is the rise of antibiotic-resistant strain. In recent years, cases of plague resistant to standard drug treatments have been identified. If antibiotic resistance becomes widespread in plague bacteria, our primary defense against this ancient killer would be compromised. We would face a disease that once brought empires to their knees with medical tools not substantially more effective than what 6th century physicians possessed. The possibility of plague returning as a major threat to human populations is not mere speculation. All the conditions that allowed past pandemics exist today in amplified form. We have global travel networks that would spread disease far faster than any ancient trade route. We have vast urban centers with population densities that ancient cities never approached. We have growing populations of drug-resistant bacteria. We have the potential for the plague bacterium to acquire new genetic traits through mutation or gene transfer from other organisms. The plague of Justinian stands as a monument to human vulnerability. It reminds us that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe, that a microscopic organism can bring down empires and plunge continents into darkness, that the line between order and apocalyptic chaos is thinner than we imagine. The disease that transformed the ancient world into the medieval still exists, still carries the potential for catastrophic mortality. The towers of bodies, the seas thick with floating dead, the cities emptied of life, all of it could, in theory, happen again. And that possibility, lurking in the DNA of bacteria living in burrows and nests across the world, remains one of humanity's oldest and most persistent nightmares. We tell ourselves a comforting story about progress, that we've climbed some grand ladder of civilization, ascending from the darkness of ancient plagues into the bright clarity of modern understanding. But when you dig into the patterns connecting these ancient catastrophes, when you really examine what remains in the archaeological record and the genetic scars written into our very DNA, that comfort begins to feel disturbingly fragile. Look at what keeps appearing, again and again across millennia. Climate disruption destabilizing societies. Environmental collapse weakening populations just before disease strikes. Warfare creating the perfect conditions for pathogens to flourish. Trade routes transforming from arteries of prosperity into highways of death. These aren't random occurrences scattered through history. They're a rhythm, a terrible drumbeat that pulses through human civilization. And perhaps, most unsettling of all, we see the same patterns accelerating in our own time. Modern science has given us extraordinary insights. We can sequence ancient DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in medieval mass graves. We can identify the specific strain of Yersinia pestis that killed them, trace its evolution, map its spread across continents. We know things our ancestors could never have imagined. Yet for all this knowledge, entire categories of ancient plagues remain completely mysterious. Historical texts describe symptoms that match no known pathogen, mass die-offs that left behind no identifiable biological signature, epidemics that behaved in ways that violate everything we understand about disease transmission. Some of these plagues are simply extinct now. The pathogens died out, evolved into something unrecognizable, or exist in reservoirs we haven't discovered, which means there are ancient apocalypses we can never fully understand, no matter how sophisticated our technology becomes. We're reading accounts of civilizations watching themselves die, and we cannot tell them what killed them, even with all our modern capabilities. These weren't mere historical events, entries in a timeline to be memorized and forgotten. These catastrophes fundamentally shaped human civilization. They determined which societies survived and which vanished. They influenced religious beliefs that still guide billions of people today. They're embedded in our genetic immunity, written into the code that determines whether our bodies can fight off certain infections. The descendants of plague survivors carry biological advantages their ancestors paid for in mountains of corpses. And perhaps, most haunting of all, these traumas never really disappeared. They transformed into myths, into warnings, into cultural memories that persisted long after anyone remembered what actually happened. Our ancestors survived apocalypses without understanding what killed them, without knowing why some lived while others died. They passed down their terror and stories of divine punishment, of invisible demons, of corruption in the air itself. They weren't wrong to be afraid. They simply lacked the vocabulary to name what hunted them. Which brings us to the question we need to ask ourselves, here in our climate-controlled rooms with our genetic sequencing and our epidemiological model. Are we truly more prepared than they were? Or have we simply traded their helplessness for a different kind, one dressed up in the language of science and statistics? We know more, certainly. But does knowing protect us when the next pandemic emerges? When climate systems destabilize? When our global trade networks become vectors for something we've never encountered before? The uncomfortable truth is that nature doesn't care about our technology. The pathogens evolving in warming permafrost, in melting ice, in disrupted ecosystems around the world, they're not impressed by our knowledge. And the same patterns that destroyed our ancestors, climate chaos and environmental collapse and interconnected trade routes, those are intensifying now at a scale and speed unprecedented in human history. We may have better tools than they did, but we've also created vulnerabilities they never imagined. A globalized world where disease can circle the planet in hours instead of years. Populations concentrated in megacities that would make ancient Rome look like a village. Supply chains so complex and fragile that disruption cascades into catastrophe. Perhaps the illusion of control is the most dangerous thing we've inherited from all this history. The belief that because we can name and measure these threats, we've somehow transcended them. Our ancestors survived, but entire civilizations didn't. And they left behind warnings we're only now learning to read, written in mass graves and abandoned cities, and the traumatic memories encoded in myth. The question isn't whether we know more than they did. The question is whether we're listening to what their suffering tried to teach us, or whether we're doomed to learn those lessons again, in our own blood and tears. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.